The Kalb Report is funded by a grant from the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation. From the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., this is the Kalb Report with Marvin Kalb.
Welcome to the National Press Club and to another edition of the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb, and our subject today, the American Story, a master class with David McCullough. So sit back, relax, and let's all learn from a writer and historian who richly deserves the accolades heaped upon him. 2 Pulitzer Prizes for biographies of President John Adams and Harry Truman, 2 National Book Awards, and a Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest honor any civilian can get. All told, he's written 10 books, bestsellers, narrated the Civil War, a documentary series on PBS, and won many, many awards. He is, if I may say, one of a kind. David McCullough, welcome. We are all honored to have you with us.
Thank you, Marvin, very much.
Now, tell me, to start, how does one become a David McCullough?
You grow up in Pittsburgh.
That's where we start.
Yeah, and you pick out good mothers and fathers, and you have the good fortune to go to superb schools, both public and private. And I feel now a powerful sense of gratitude, as I'm sure comes to all of us as the years pass, for all that my family and my teachers opened for me in the way of passages to the work I've done. I don't know if you know Billy Collins' poem called The Lanyard.
Tell me about it.
Well, it starts out that he went to camp as a teenager, and at camp he made a lanyard out of plastic thread, a thing you put around your neck and you hang your keys or whatever on it. And he came home from camp and gave the lanyard to his mother. And the poem expresses it wonderfully. I can't quote it exactly, but he said, "She gave me birth, she nourished me at her breast, she soothed my feverish brow with a cold cloth when I was quite ill, and what did I give her? A lanyard." And it goes on like that, so that we all want to go back and say to our mothers and fathers and those teachers that changed our lives, thank you from the bottom of my heart.
But there is one thing specifically. I remember you telling a story about the importance of dinner time conversations
Yes.
in the McCullough household and the importance of history as an issue that came up night after night after night. Tell us about that.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons I feel that growing up in Pittsburgh was a huge break, because it's a city of history. All kinds of things happened there. George Washington's defeat at Fort Necessity, which brought on the our war with France, and obviously the whole movement to the west down the Ohio River. And my father and my grandmother used to talk about the fires that happened in Pittsburgh. The whole city virtually burned down at one, and the floods and the strikes and the violence and the good things and the bad things, the invention, the startups, if you will, that began there. And then they would talk about family history, and I love particularly when they get onto the eccentrics back in the family tree. And they talked politics. It was during the years that Franklin Roosevelt was president, and my father was a Republican, and my grandmother thought that except for Jesus Christ, that Franklin Roosevelt was the greatest human being that ever lived. And they would get into what we would politely call discussions on the subject. And what made them so memorable is that they were both quite hard of hearing. So that I learned about the New Deal at a decibel level that one would never forget. And I think that we learned a lot, as so many people growing up did, at the dinner table. So I say bring back dinner, bring back the dinner table. In writing many of my books, and particularly in writing the book I've just published on the Wright brothers, I've reminded again and again of how important how we're brought up at home is to our whole lives. Yes, school, grade school, high school, college, very, very important. But it's those fundamental values that you learn at home about honesty, about loyalty, about hard work, about never getting too big for your britches, and never using language that would cause your mother to clean your mouth out with soap.
The thing that I am curious about is the impact of those history lessons, the early history lessons, had upon your development as a historian, because right now in the US, history appears to be a lost art in American education. We're not spending that much time finding out where we all collectively came from. And I'm wondering, from your perspective now, what is it that we are losing?
Our memory. We're experiencing, it's very evident, it's all been tabulated, a kind of spreading amnesia about who we are and where we came from and why we are the way we are. And I was struck by this profoundly several times 20, 25 years ago when I first started lecturing at colleges and universities. And I gave a talk at one Middle Western college, and after the talk, a young sophomore, a very attractive, obviously bright young woman, came up and thanked me for coming to the campus to give the talk. She said, because until I heard your talk today, I never realized that the original 13 colonies were all on the East Coast. And I thought, what are we doing so wrong? I was taught a seminar at one of the foremost of our Ivy League colleges. I had 25 students, all history majors, all honors students, and all seniors. And to get the conversation going the first day that we gathered around the table, about 25 students, I said, how many of you know who George C. Marshall was? Not one. Finally, one boy said, did he maybe have something to do with the Marshall Plan? And so we were off and running. Well, I decided I would try it again at another college. Same reaction. And one fellow said, did he have anything to do with martial law? So a little problem with spelling, too. But it's not their faults. It's our faults. And 80% of the colleges, or nearly 80% of the colleges and universities in the country today, no longer require any history in order to graduate.
Leaving us where?
Yes. Well, leaving a decline, sharp decline in the humanities, the teaching of the humanities. And their English is terrible. Something like half the business schools today are requiring incoming freshmen, who are all, of course, college graduates, to take a basic writing course because they can't write a presentable letter or a presentable proposal or report of any kind. And when I look, for example, at the letters written by the Wright brothers, who never went to college, that are all on file here at the Library of Congress, they are superbly written. The grammar is superb. They're effective in how they convey their ideas or their worries or whatever, and the vocabulary is astonishing. And all they had was a high school education. And again, it was how they were raised at home. The father, who was an itinerant minister, said, you must learn to use the English language on your feet and on paper. And he insisted upon it, and he practiced what he preached. They grew up in a house that had no running water, no indoor plumbing, no electricity, no telephone, but lots of books.
Lots of books.
And they had what was in effect a full liberal arts education at home, history, English, the classics, and they turned out to be the two human beings who cracked one of the most difficult technical problems of all time.
It's an extraordinary story. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. You went to Yale, which is a reasonably good school, I'm told. And there you met prominent writers, excuse me, including the novelist Thornton Wilder,
Yes.
who told you at one point that writers must have what he called an air of freedom.
Yes.
What do you think he meant?
Well, the problem with the past tense, it happened, it makes it seem like it's locked in. So in writing history, you've got to reinstate the air of freedom, the air that none of your characters know what's ahead of them. There is no such thing as the foreseeable future. Not now, never was. But he also said, when he was asked how he came up with the plays or the novels he wrote, he said, I imagine a story that I would like to see performed on stage, or that I would like to read in a book. And if I find that nobody's written it, I write it so I can see it performed on stage and so I can read the book. Well, I ran into some photographs at the Library of Congress way back in the 1960s when Rosalie and I were living here, taken in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, right after the flood. A photographer from Pittsburgh had gotten over the mountains and into the city. And keep in mind, this was a disaster literally as terrible as 9/11, in that over 2,500 people were killed. Mm-hmm. And it need never have happened. And I thought, what happened? I didn't know that this destruction. I had no idea of the devastation. Mm-hmm. So I took a book out of the library, and it wasn't very good. And I thought, why don't you write the book that you'd wish you could read? And that's what started me down the road in history. I was an English major in college, and I'd had some history, but not much. But once I got going, I knew this is what I want to do for the rest of my life.
I want to talk to you about this idea, this concept of freedom, the air of freedom. I've always been fascinated by this. And the whole idea that many of us in this room think that we are entitled to be free people. And I'm wondering, what was the true role of the concept of freedom in motivating the American Revolution?
Well, it was an expression of faith that we on this continent could put the restrictions, the traditions that lock people into a certain role or a certain class in life that were so prevalent in Europe, that we could start anew here and be free, and intellectually free. We pledge our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor. What is honor? Nobody talks about honor anymore. Mm-hmm. And that was of extreme importance to those people. And that they were going to do it themselves and no hiding their identity. Every single one of those men who signed the Declaration of Independence was signing his death warrant. Hmm. Because if they failed in their attempt, they would be hung as traitors. So that in itself was quite a commitment. The power of the Trumbull painting that hangs in the rotunda of the Capitol is not the accuracy of the room. There's nothing accurate about that painting except the faces. And he went and painted 36 or so from life. And they knew that. So their identity is on the record, both visually and in their signature. And that was a huge commitment. They're all doing it together. And I think what most people don't know or don't remember is there were only 1/3 of the country was for the revolution. The other third were strongly against it. And the remaining third, in the good old human way, were waiting to see who won. And we had no navy. We had very little in the way of an army. We had virtually no trained military leaders of any kind. A man like Henry Knox was a bookseller. And he becomes a general, and he becomes one of the greatest leaders in the whole Union, in the whole American army during the war. But he had studied military operations, military history, leadership in the military in a fanatical way. So he'd done his homework, and he felt he could do it. And Washington had the gift of spotting ability when he saw it.
It's an interesting fact to me that John Adams, about whom you have written, was the only signatory to the Declaration of Independence who never owned slaves.
That's right.
And maybe it was all of the others did, or most of them did. And I'm wondering, from your vantage point, as you look back upon that now, how does one account for what could be described as a gigantic moral failure?
Mistake.
Mistake. Failure.
Well, the Northwest Territory, which are the 5 states in the Middle West, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, so forth, was established before we had a constitution, and by the Congress, the Continental Congress, and it not only guaranteed public support for education in all those 5 states, but no slavery. So, as we know, Ohio was right across the river from Kentucky, the slaves, and the whole flow of people escaping from the south into the north. All that happened before we had a constitution. If only they could have just said no slaves in any state right then. Think what it would have saved us.
But you used the word mistake, but it was more than that. It had to do with the kind of people they were. How could they do what they did from a moral point of view?
Hard to understand. And we cannot, I really feel, we cannot condemn them for that. We cannot erase their names from university walls or whatever, or tear down the Washington Monument, or change the name of this city. We have to put ourselves in that other time, and that's also what's so important in how history is written and how history is taught. History should never be anything but human. History is human. It's about people, and therefore it also should never, ever be boring. Nor should it ever convey that it was all on a track, because it was never on a track. It could have gone off in any number of different directions for any number of different reasons, and principally, very often, because of individual people. Imagine if that fellow who had tried to kill Franklin Roosevelt in Florida had succeeded. Imagine if Churchill had been, when he was hit by the taxi in New York and almost died, had died, and we'd gone into the 1930s and 40s with no Churchill and no Franklin Roosevelt. And who's to say what throw of the dice causes that? But you have to understand those people, and it's getting inside them as human beings, inside their world, inside their time, that I think is essential to conveying with accuracy what happened.
Within that context, I want to cite this very famous quote from Thomas Jefferson before he became our 3rd president. "Were it left to me to decide," he said, "whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." And yet when he became president, he changed his tune completely. And he said, "The man who reads nothing at all is better educated than the man who reads nothing but newspapers." Now, why has there always been this kind of cranky relationship between the media, as we call it today, the press, and the presidents, whether it's Jefferson or Obama? Why that kind of relationship? And is that crankiness a good thing for our country?
Yes. Why? Because we all need to face up to our human failures, our human inadequacies, our inconsistencies. And I must say, there's nothing unusual about a politician getting elected president and changing his views on how things are.
Heavens!
Nothing whatever new about that. Jefferson didn't mean it. He had a very thin skin, and
they all do, don't they?
not all.
No,
Harry Truman didn't.
did not.
unless they were talking about his wife. That's right. No, he could take anything of that kind. That's part of the job, he'd say. Jefferson also said, any nation that expects to be ignorant and free expects to be what never was and never will be. And his belief in education, his belief in learning and the life of the adventure of the mind is in itself reason enough to have enormous respect for him. He was also, and I take this quite to heart, one of the greatest architects in our whole history. And I think it's important to stress that history isn't just about politics and the military. Yes, politics and the military have extreme importance, but they are not the whole story. Music and art and architecture and science and technology and medicine and finance, everything is part of history. And very often, and this has in effect been my cause in life, there are figures in our past who deserve far more attention than they've ever received. I believe in giving credit where credit's due, or long overdue. I also believe in writing about people who had an uphill climb and who were defeated or made mistakes repeatedly and didn't get knocked down, lie there and whimper and whine and blame it on other people, but got back up on their feet, learned from their mistakes, and pushed on.
The importance of failure.
Yes, the importance of failure. I think that when we're choosing a leader, we should take a very careful look at how many times he's had to face failure or a mistake, an embarrassing mistake. And if they've never known failure, I'd say be careful, because anybody who's going to be president of the United States is going to fail. You're going to have things go wrong. I had a professor from MIT call me, and he wanted to start a course on failure because he said the students today have no interest or no awareness. We all make mistakes. We all fail at something. And he said to me, I'm going to start this course, and would you be willing to come and give a talk on why the French failed in their attempt to build the Panama Canal? I said, I'd love to. He said, well, I'll get back to you, and we'll pick a date. And I never heard from him. And I ran into him at a meeting one time out in Cleveland. I said, what happened? Oh, he said the course was a failure. Nobody wanted to take it.
Well, now Harry Truman is a president you have written about, and as we know, he was pummeled during the time that he was in office by the press, by the politicians, and he left office with an embarrassingly low popularity rating. And yet we know from your book and much else that Harry Truman accomplished some amazing things and is now regarded very much as a good president.
Our whole attitude toward him has changed, which is another important thing about history. How it's measured, how it's evaluated, what the impression of certain events and certain people changes with time. As I said, I grew up in a very Republican home, and I was 15 years old in 1948, and I was following the presidential election with close interest. And the night of the election, the final count didn't come in until about 2 o'clock in the morning. I tried to stay up to hear the results, but couldn't stay awake. The next morning, my father was in shaving, and I went in and said, Dad, who won? He said, Truman, like it was the end of the world. Absolutely, oh, Truman. 20, 30 years went by, and I was back home, and we were sitting chatting after dinner one night, and he started in on how the world was going to hell, the country was going to hell, and then he paused and he said, too bad old Harry isn't still in the White House. But that's the way it swung.
Right.
And for good reason. I think one of my favorite Truman stories, because what so much of this is about is strength of character, integrity. He was about to appoint George Marshall Secretary of State, and there was a meeting in the Oval Office, and one of his young political advisors, I think it was probably Clark Clifford, said, Mr. President, if I may say so, you might want to think twice about appointing General Marshall Secretary of State. And Truman said, well, why is that? He said, because if he becomes president, in 2 or 3, 4 or 5 months, people will start saying he'd make a better president than you are. And Truman said he would make a better president than I am, but I'm the president, and I want the best possible people around me. He knew who he was. He didn't try to act like somebody else. He didn't try to imitate Franklin Roosevelt or any of that. He was Harry Truman. And they could be taller, they could be better educated, they could be handsomer, whatever. If they wanted to help him work to solve all these problems, so be it. So much the better.
But that is not and wasn't at the time a commonly accepted view of Harry Truman. And I'm wondering whether...
Wait, excuse me, just a minute. In his first months or year or so in office, he had one of the highest ratings ever. People forget
and then
that.
it rather
yes, because all
dramatically
went wrong, yeah.
But what I was trying to get at here is whether you feel that the news media have the capacity to mislead the American people into misinterpreting an incumbent president.
Absolutely.
Why do you think that?
They're human.
They're human.
You
go back to that theme.
And they tend to go with the crowd, meaning their own professional crowd. When they were predicting who would win the '48 election, they interviewed 50 of the top journalists in the country covering presidential politics. All 50 said Dewey was going to win. But Truman didn't let that bother him. He stayed himself, and he understood what was going on in the minds of the people of the country. And he knew how to get back up on his feet when he got knocked down, if anybody ever did.
I want to take a moment now, if you don't mind, to remind our many audiences on radio, television, and the internet that this is the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb, and I'm talking with historian David McCullough about the American story. Sir, you and I have both lived long enough to have observed a number of ups and downs in American history. And we are told now by very respectable folks, and not just during the presidential campaign, that the United States as a nation is in a period of decline, that people around the world don't respect us anymore, that we don't win anymore, to quote a presidential candidate. Now, you've seen events from a historical perspective. In your judgment, are we indeed in a period of decline?
No.
Why do you say that?
Well, first of all, bad news is always more appealing to the readers and to the viewers of television than good news. Mm-hmm. And I have traveled all over this country. In the last year, I've been in 26 states and spoken I don't know how many times. And in every city that I've been in, something of positive, admirable accomplishment is happening. And people are very pleased with how things are improving in their town or with what their people are doing. I spent part of this last winter in Charleston, South Carolina. And the mayor of Charleston, Joe Riley, just retired after 40 years as mayor of Charleston, South Carolina, during which he performed an example of political responsibility that I don't think I've ever known to equal it. He's been superb. And he's transformed that city, and through very trying, unexpected blows of hurricanes and racial murder and all of the rest. Imagine, 10 times he was reelected, and he's done a superb job. And he's not just the only example. My hometown of Pittsburgh has been transformed back into real life again. We don't talk about what's happening in medicine. Imagine what's happened just in our lifetime in medicine. We just take that for granted. Oh yeah, sure, that's the way. I think very possibly when future historians are evaluating this period in history, in this country most obviously, that what has happened in medicine will be seen as one of the most important developments of all. Now, we also have to understand there was no perfect time past. I hear people on talk shows saying, oh, you have to remember that was a simpler time. No, it was not. There never was a simpler time. We have always been facing calamity, the sense that we're on the brink of something terrible about to happen. It could be anywhere from the influenza epidemic of 1918-19, one of the worst things that ever happened in the world, let alone this country. 500,000 people died. Now, if you were to have that happen today, proportionate to our population, 1,500,000 people would die in this country of a disease that we didn't know where it came from. We don't know how to get rid of it, and we don't know how much longer it's going to last. Imagine that on the nightly news every day.
But
That's real.
no, I'm not arguing that
No.
point at all. I'm trying to get an understanding of how would you persuade the majority of the American people who do listen and watch these talk programs. All over the world, there are polls that indicate that America is not, in fact, regarded as highly as it once was. How do you turn this around? How
Accomplishment. Literal, positive, admirable accomplishment in all fields, not just medicine or science or technology, but in political behavior, in political dialogue. Brush up our language, clean up our language, stop showboating endlessly, preening before the audience as your way of making your point. And substantive questioning on the part of the press. The questions.
Okay, you have opened up a field which I love. Two questions, both related. How, on the one side, can we understand the phenomenon of Donald J. Trump as the candidate, the presumptive candidate of one of the two major political parties in this country? Two, why hasn't the media asked the questions that you are implying?
You could answer that better than I.
I'm not sure I can.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I can. There's a way in which I have watched reporters ask Trump questions. They are good questions. They are probing questions. But Trump has a way of slipping around the intent of the question and going off on a tangent somewhere. How did the wonderful American political experiment, how did it produce Trump?
How does the party of Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt and Dwight Eisenhower even consider nominating a man who's risen to his wealth and prominence by television shows and owning gambling casinos, who's never served his country in any way ever, and who doesn't seem to have any curiosity about what he might need to know in order to do the job. It would be as if we were about to put somebody in the pilot's seat who's never flown an airplane, and we're all going to get on board? Now, if you look at the polls, and not just look at what his standing is in his own party or what is the fragments of his own party, he's not doing very well at all. If you look at the national poll, the whole voting audience, it's never easy, Marvin, never easy. And we have to take pride, and we have to take our confidence from how much we know we're capable of doing with the right kind of leadership. And the right kind of leadership isn't just going to come from politicians. It's going to come from people in all fields. Education, I think, more than any other.
There is a kind of, not only unhappiness, but there's a feeling of something approaching fear, something between anxiety and fear among many Americans today. I quote, for example, an excellent piece that Carl Bernstein, a terrific reporter who had a great deal to do with the Watergate scandal, Bernstein wrote that the phenomenon of Trump at this point in American politics is an unfortunate mix of celebrity salesmanship and neo-fascism. And the question in my mind when I read that and that word jumped out at me, is the greatness of America, the political system, all of that, in a free election, capable of producing a president who would be a neo-fascist?
Capable, given that unforeseen events could take place that we can't include in our calculations. I would say I hope fervently with all my heart that the answer is no, we're not going to go that way. And if you look, for example, at the poll about Governor Kasich, most of the people would have preferred him to the other two. And yet, he didn't get it, didn't make it. But we don't know. He might suddenly emerge. We don't know who may come along and say something, do something. But we can't wait for somebody else to do those things. We've got to do them ourselves. Imagine having to turn off the television when one of the political candidates is giving a talk because you don't want your young children to hear the way he expresses himself. It would be very easy to blame television. The showbiz color and carnival act style of so much of television. Loud is part of our culture now. There are restaurants that have designed the acoustics so they're noisier than they would be normally. So if you're loud enough, you get attention. But that grows tiresome pretty fast. And I say, in answer to Mr. Jefferson, that the press can be the saving element in the next 5 months or whatever it is.
How?
By bearing down and making these candidates tell us what they're really about and what they know and what they don't know and how they're going to make up for what they don't know, and ask them sort of basic questions. Have you ever seen the questions that immigrants who are becoming American citizens have to answer about the history of our country? Have you ever seen that?
I have, yes.
I'd like to ask some of these candidates for the presidency to see how they do on that. And we are a nation of immigrants. That's what we're about. That's who we are. And think of what we would not have accomplished if so many immigrants, as we now call them, had not been allowed into the country. What we wouldn't have done, what we wouldn't have discovered we stand for.
Yeah. In your Adams biography, you make note of the fact that Jefferson used to hurl violent invective, rhetorical, of course, at Adams, and aided and abetted by the press. Do you think that Jefferson would feel right at home in today's world of invective, or would he feel that we have actually plunged to yet a newer?
No, he would be very ill-suited and uncomfortable in political life today because he avoided conflict. He stayed out of the brawl. He never said a word on the floor of Congress. Nothing,
Really?
no. He let Adams do all that. He didn't like that.
You were going to do a book once, right, about Jefferson and
Yes.
Adams, and ended up choosing just the Adams. Why
Yes.
did you do that?
I found Adams much more interesting. And also there was much more to work with because Jefferson, for example, destroyed, we don't even know what his wife looked like. He destroyed every letter she ever wrote to him and every letter or anything he'd ever written to her and just blotted her out. And he really never brings you into what he was feeling about life and about his own anguish or worries or emotional world. Whereas Adams tells you everything, and so does his wife, Abigail, who, by the way, I think is one of the great Americans. And if he never owned a slave, I can't prove this, it was probably because of her, because she was adamant on the subject, to her everlasting credit.
Did women get enough credit? Do women get enough credit
No.
for the role that they played
No,
at that?
no, never have, and we got to make up for it. Truly, that's why I took great pleasure in writing about Emily Roebling, the wife of the engineer of the Brooklyn Bridge, and all that she did to make it happen. Or in my recent book, the Wright brothers' sister Catherine. I don't think that the story would have come out as it did had it not been for her. She was of extreme importance and a very interesting human being.
On the role of a free press, in this country, do you think that we would have been able to maintain our freedom as a nation up to this point, were it not for the existence of
No.
an irritating press?
No. It's essential. And it's essential, and this is very important, that we know that we count on accuracy in the press. We count on if what they say is in print in this marvelous, long-standing newspaper, we know it's accurate, and if it isn't, they'll correct it 2 days later. There's so much now electronically available. It's never checked by anybody. And an awful lot of what our young people are learning is inaccurate. It's because of that. You have to have confidence that people of professional integrity get strength of character, once again. They are living up to their professional responsibilities and their professional standards of excellence.
Are you concerned that
When you think of the people we worked with, you and I, in our time in this field, and what superb human beings they were, not just talented writers or gifted people on the air, but really terrific human beings trying to do the best they could in the job they knew mattered. A job that mattered not just to them, but to our country.
well, do you worry that it's not, excuse me, continuing, excuse me, that it's not continuing because of the existence of the new media, the way in which journalists function today?
Yes, and the decline of the
Being
importance of the
significantly
papers,
different.
people who don't even read a newspaper anymore. That's worrisome. However, because I have spent my life trying to understand the history of our country, and this may sound naive, but it's absolutely what I believe. I'm an optimist. I know that we'll come out of this. There's a line from Churchill that I adore. When he came across to meet with the Canadians and the Americans in 1942, very brave thing for him to do, to go to sea at that point when we didn't have much control over life on the Atlantic, and German submarines were sinking our own oil tankers off the coast of Florida. And he came over, and in a speech he said, "We haven't journeyed this far because we're made of sugar candy." That's still my very confident belief.
You're an optimist, but is it possible that you're also just a romantic?
Oh, of course.
No, and therefore
No,
more,
I love Gershwin, I love Cole Porter,
but a romantic in the sense of American history, which is your profession, that you tend to look, I'm asking you really, if you feel that you tend to look and you're too romantic about the way in which you approach people, the selection of presidents that you write about.
I don't think I'm so much of a romantic as I have to ask myself, I'm going to spend 5 years with this man or this
Right,
woman,
right.
or maybe more. And do I want him for my roommate that long a time? I have to be with somebody that I find interesting. I've never undertaken a subject I knew much about. If I knew all about it, I wouldn't want to do it. To me, embarking on a book is an adventure. It's a journey. It's putting my foot on a continent I've never been to before. And when I start the book, I don't really know much about what happens to that character in his whole or her whole life. I want to get to it as they did, chronologically. And always there are surprises. And always when I realize what they have been through, my admiration for them increases. Even if I don't necessarily agree with them, or feel that they are so marvelous that we must bow down in reverence. No. I've always loved to paint. And I still do. I've done it all my life. And I've thought very seriously of becoming a portrait painter, and I studied portrait painting at the Yale School of Art. And the only way, if I were painting your portrait now, that I could show the light and the wonderful sparkle in your eyes is if I have the shadow or the dark side of your face too, to make the light side look better. And in
My mother would only like the light side.
but you wouldn't be able to see it unless there was a dark side, and the dark behind you, so that your face stands out. Well, it's the same in writing about people. You've got to show the shady side or the dark side. Otherwise, the light side, it will not only stand out, but it will be, are you ready? Boring. Perfection is boring. Thank goodness none of us are perfect. Imperfection is the human story.
Tell us what you may be writing about next.
Well, I was hoping, Marvin, you'd give me a good idea.
What's that?
I'm sorry, I want you to give me a good idea.
So you want me to?
No, yeah. No,
I'm just here to ask
I
questions.
have about 7 or 8 ideas right now that I'm
You really?
exploring. Yes, indeed.
About
I keep
an
a running
American-
list.
An American president?
One is about an American president, but not his presidency.
Obama? No, you don't want to play that game.
No, I'll tell you who it is, John Quincy Adams, and his years in the House. Imagine, a president of the United States who's been an ambassador all over the world to about 5 different countries, served in the Senate, became president, and then when he was quite old by the standards of the time, he was in his 60s, comes back to serve 17 years in the House of Representatives and fights slavery as no one else did and dies on the job, on the floor of the House of Representatives, what's now Statuary Hall. And was a man of absolute courage and integrity and brilliant in the extreme. He may have had the highest IQ of anyone who's ever been in the White House.
You said earlier that so many presidents are not really given the honors that they should have at that time.
Right.
You got to sort of look back.
Right.
And John Quincy Adams would certainly be one of them.
Yes, he's one of them. Well, and he
What themes?
he was a character too, and that helps.
Well, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But what themes? I mean, Adams is a wonderful subject in the family. And what themes would you also think about taking on? New themes, things in the old days that, as the Wright brothers, that sort of idea.
Well, I liked the theme of accomplishment, of value, admirable accomplishment, against the odds, against public opinion, against the stroke of the pen or whatever. And I like people who rise from obscure or modest beginnings. And I'm very fond of the old Midwestern values. I see strong resemblances between Harry Truman, for example, and the Wright brothers, though they were of very different modes of life or accomplishment. And there's an old novelist adage, keep your hero in trouble. And so I like subjects where they're facing real trouble all the time, again and again, and yet they keep on going. My book on Washington in 1776, it was nothing but trouble from start to finish. He could have walked off that job with very good reason almost at any point. He made mistakes, he failed again and again, but they would not give up. And that's not just admirable. And this isn't romantic. That's an American attitude. You don't give up. And particularly if it's something that you believe in.
Right.
And again, how you were raised at home. We've got to know more about that. How we're brought up at home, even before we get to school, or all during the time, say, when we're living at home and going to school. And education. We cannot underestimate the importance of education. I think the most important people in our country today, by far, are our teachers, the good teachers. They are doing what will matter in the long run more than any of us are.
Tell me, I once heard you say that if you were not a historian enjoying the research, the writing, the engagement with people, you'd probably end up being a pianist. And I'm wondering, do you still feel that way? And would you ever imagine leaving history to become a pianist or a painter, which you're doing now anyway?
Yes, I could leave to do painting all the time.
You do that at the same time?
Yes, the great thing about painting is that when you're doing it, you don't think about anything else. and you don't have to use, are you ready, Marvin? You don't have to use any words. So it's a real vacation, and I love it. And I teach courses in writing, and I always urge the students to take a course in drawing or painting, because, well, Dickens said, make me see this scene or this character. And if you learn to draw and paint, you look at people, you look at the setting, you look at everything in a different way than you've ever looked before, because you have to. It helps.
Yeah. That's a fascinating idea. You and I both...
And lots of people, Churchill, as we know, was a painter.
Yes.
And when Eisenhower took command of just before D-Day over there, Churchill said, have you got something you can do to take your mind off all the pressures that are on your shoulders? He said, no, I don't. He said, well, you better do it, or you'll collapse. You won't be able to handle it. He said, I've always painted, and it works for me, and I highly recommend it. Eisenhower started painting. He's painted for the rest of his life. He never became the painter that Churchill was, but Katharine Hepburn, Tony Bennett, George W. Bush, all painting, right up to the end. And once you do it, you think, why haven't I done this more often? Yeah.
I want to ask you, because we are running out of time, but I want to ask you about the role of the individual in history. And as you look back through American history, who are the one or two or three Americans who, on their own, made an enormous difference to the history of the country?
On their own, meaning other than politics?
Well, no, working even within the political system, yes.
Well, I think our most important president was George Washington. Because he was number one. He's had to set the example, and he set a superb example of integrity, proper behavior, honesty, fidelity, and courage, and character. Mm-hmm. Lincoln, of inestimable importance, primarily because of his use of the English language. Mm. Words matter. Words matter in the extreme. And we've been very fortunate. Kennedy had it and changed a lot of our attitudes. I took a huge swerve in my whole life when he called on us to serve our country. I quit my job to come down here to work somewhere to help serve my country. And as a consequence, wound up discovering what I wanted to do with my life. So I would pick people like the Wright brothers, changed history, changed the world. There's a man out in Pittsburgh named Tom Starzl, who was one of the most brilliant organ transplant surgeons in the world, who changed the whole possibility of saving lives that way. Oh, there's an infinite number. I think John Singer Sargent, absolutely fantastic man, brilliant in the extreme, genius. There is such a thing as genius.
Does somebody have to be a genius to be great?
No. No,
you have
not
to
at all.
have what to be great? What's the common
backbone?
Tissue.
Backbone. And empathy. The power of empathy, to put yourself in the other person's place. And kindness. Genuine kindness.
Enough of that around today?
No. There's never enough of that around. Oh. Never has been enough of that around. And tolerance. And faith that we are all part of the human experience. And never, ever stop asking questions. Curiosity. Curiosity is what separates us from the cabbages. And it needs to be encouraged. Ask questions. Ask people questions. Talk to people. Talk to people of all kinds.
I intend to continue asking people questions, including, as we begin to run out of time, this one final question to you. What advice would you have for young people today, many in this audience, especially those who would like to be journalists? What advice would you have for them?
Get going. Do it.
Get going. Do it.
Get the job. Go find a job. Do it. Absolutely. Things can turn. Well, maybe no longer it looks very promising for journalists. Who knows? 10 years, it might be the most exciting time in journalism ever. We don't know what's ahead. There's no foreseeable future. And there never was ever anything like a self-made man or self-made woman. We are all the result of influences of all kinds of people and the people we work with. And if you want to go into journalism, I'd say one of the most attractive aspects of that career are the people you get to work with. Wonderful, bright, energetic, imaginative people.
I always had a feeling that journalists were the best people in the world.
Well, you may be right, Marvin.
Anyway, our time has come, and the moment that I feared from the very beginning of this interview is that our time is up for it. I want first to thank our wonderful audience here, there, and everywhere, and equally important, our extraordinary, delightful guest, David McCullough, for sharing his insights with us, for taking the time to be with us. But that is it for now. I'm Marvin Kalb, and as Ed Murrow used to say many, many years ago, good night and good luck.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
That's wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now come to that moment when we have an opportunity for you to ask our guest questions. If you come to where the microphone is, one on this side here, one on this side here. Please, when you come to ask a question, do us the honor of asking a question and not making a speech, and identify yourself, please.
Hi, Art Swift, managing editor at Gallup. I was struck so much by the Johnstown flood and the story of a very avoidable story, as you mentioned earlier, and how this disaster could have not necessarily happened. Are there things that you've seen since then in recent years that are equivalent to that? Or is this kind of event happening so often that we've become desensitized to it?
Well, I've certainly seen nothing on the scale of that since. But again, I don't know enough about what caused certain disasters in far-off places in the world to say, well, that's just like the Johnstown flood. But you could say that it's when we assume that other people are acting responsibly, and they're not, that's when we can face trouble, real trouble. And the Johnstown flood need never have happened because of human indifference. Oh, they'll take care of that. The people that own the dam may be sure to look after it. Oh, the people that own the dam, the engineers that are in charge, they'll look after it. And there were some people in town saying this is a serious, worrisome situation, and particularly the head of the Cambria Iron Company, and alas, he died. And that shadow of doubt, that question, that sense of responsibility, died with him in that town before something was done and the disaster struck. When my book was published, I right away had two other publishers come to me. One wanted me to do the Chicago fire, and the other wanted me to do the San Francisco earthquake. And I was 32 at the time, and I thought, I'm only 32 and I'm already being typecast as Bad News McCullough. And I had this really deep desire, longing to write about something that human beings did that was done right. I was looking for a symbol of affirmation, and I probably have been looking for that in many ways in all my work. And by just pure chance, at a lunch I was having with two friends in New York, one of whom was a science writer and the other of whom was an engineer. And they started talking about what the Roeblings didn't know when they set out to build the Brooklyn Bridge. And I thought, that's my subject. And I just knew it immediately. And I went right out of that lunch, right to the 42nd Street Library, took those marble stairs 3 at a time, went to the card catalog to see if the book that was already forming in my head had been written, found that there were 50 cards in there on the subject, but none of the book that I wanted to write, and I was off and going. And we should take heart from these accomplishments. I spoke last night at our Capitol, and I talked about that building and what a phenomenal American expression, American creation, a work of art, architecture, engineering, and of course, emblematic in so many ways. And we just take it for granted. There it is. So I've inclined more to think about positive accomplishment than negligent disasters, disasters resulting from intellectual or literal negligence.
Good decision on your part.
Thank you.
Good decision. Yes, please.
John Kornacki, American University. You teased us that there are a lot of good biographies that are yet to be done. Stories that haven't been told or not told
Yes.
very well. Give us a few names.
Some biographies that haven't been done? Abigail Adams.
Say good ones.
A good biography?
Of someone that hasn't been done properly.
Yeah, oh, Abigail Adams. Someone like Tom Starzl, the man I mentioned, who's here with us right now, but we just take that for granted. A man named Manasseh Cutler, who was a preacher in Massachusetts. And he's the one that put through to Congress the Northwest Territory Ordinance. And his story is a hoot. He was like no preacher of that day, I'll tell you. He liked a good time. And he got the whole first movement into the Ohio Valley going, left in December, in midst of winter, from in front of his house in Ipswich. He waited until spring before he went out. But he's a terrific story. I'm more interested now in people who are less famous than the biographical subjects I picked. I just saw my grandson play the part of the stage manager in Thornton Wilder's Our Town. And to be reminded of how Wilder makes those people who accomplish nothing of any consequence by normal standards or popular standards, come alive. And that whole town, I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to do that with a community that really was and people that really were, so that you get a sense of the life and the lessons to be learned from that community and those people, which you do certainly from our town. So I'm poking around more with structural or organizational and composition of my subject than just the subject. I have about 9 different ideas I'm pursuing, including a couple of biographies or segments of the life of a person of interest.
I'm not sure this is even possible to answer, but how do you reach a decision among the 9? What makes one much more appealing to you
Well,
than
absolutely essential is quantity of good primary source material, letters, diaries, autobiographies that were never published, so that you get, about 60% of life is talk, words. And you can't make up dialogue if you're writing history and biography. Some people who write history and biography do it. Some people will say, as the Secretary of State walked from the old State Department office building over to the White House, they were thinking about what he should tell the president. You don't know what he was thinking. He was probably thinking about, what am I going to have for lunch or something? And that's cheating, in my view. You shouldn't do that. But you can quote what they wrote in letters, diaries, private journals, or what they said when they testified before Congress, or what they said in an interview with the press. And by the way, newspapers are an infinitely rich source for research on almost any subject, and particularly back before they could print photography. So, because the writers were trained to make you see what the fire looked like in the old mill downtown or whatever. And photography itself is a hugely important source, which too few historians or biographers bothered to use, as is old film. We found an old film that was motion picture made of Wilbur Wright talking to some people. And I had no way of knowing that when he talked, he would throw his arms all about and get all excited. And that's a characteristic you don't want to leave out. You want to know about something like that. Where were we? What was I? Yeah.
Please, next question.
Thank you so much for your wonderful historical writings. It would be great if they could be required reading in our schools. I've always wondered to what would you attribute the relatively negative attitudes toward the French historically, whereas they have played such positive roles as in many of your writings.
Well, this is a very, very good question.
Wilbur Wright, the Panama Canal, their contributions there.
France is figured in about more than half of the books I've written, and figured prominently and importantly. I have a wonderful sister-in-law who, when I was back home once, said to me she thought it was just wonderful the way I worked Pittsburgh into all my books. And I said, I don't work Pittsburgh into my books. Pittsburgh is part of the story. Pittsburgh is part of our history. Well, I don't work France into my books. France is a hugely important part of American history. And exactly why we don't quite go for it or understand it or recognize it is a bit of a mystery. I think part of it is the language barrier. Part of it is that we have relatively few French immigrants in our country, so we didn't all grow up with Croatians or with French the way we grew up with Croatians or Italians or Greeks or whatever. And it was not politically appealing to talk about the French and the wonderful French. In most of the big passages of our story, it was very strong when Lafayette returned, for example. He was a hero everywhere. But the importance of our people who went and served in France in 2 wars. More Americans are buried in France than any other country in the world except our own, in those cemeteries. And if you've been to them, it's a powerful and moving experience like nothing else I've ever experienced. And you go to the Argonne, for example, today, and they have a guest book where you sign that you've been there, and there's almost nobody is going there anymore. And the time will come when very few, if any, will go to Normandy, alas. Out of sight, out of mind. And it's a shame. But the ideas that have come to us from France, the caisson, for example, which made possible the building underwater foundations for bridges like the Brooklyn Bridge, was a French idea. Washington Roebling had to go over and spend a year in France to learn how to do it. It goes on and on. Medicine, my goodness. Those young Americans who went over to France to study medicine were doing so because that was the best medical training in the world. We had laws here that made it illegal to use cadavers. And that's how grave robbers and black market bodies came on the market and were very expensive. And because they were so expensive, students very rarely got to dissect an arm or a leg or a foot or whatever. That was for the doctors. So we were turning out doctors who the first time they ever took a scalpel and opened up any part of the human anatomy were doing it for the first time on a live person with no anesthetic. Imagine. You don't think we've come far? Yes, we sure as hell have. Yeah.
We've got about 4 more minutes left. Yes, your question.
Yeah, my question is about the Wright brothers, and thank you for the wonderful book. Why are they not more highly regarded or highly placed within?
Well, the book only just came out.
But
And I'm pleased to say that Tom Hanks is going to be making a miniseries for HBO the way he did with My
are
Adams
you
Book.
narrating it?
wonderful.
So it will,
That's
the
wonderful.
word will get forth.
But they seem more like they're almost forgotten. I mean, it was
Yes.
amazing. I mean, what
Well,
happened?
Most Americans know the following. They were bicycle mechanics who lived in Ohio and they invented the airplane. And that is about all I knew because that's all we were given in the 5 minutes the subject was the topic of the day in high school history. And it's a huge mistake. It's again this skewed idea of history that we have. The Wright brothers changed the world. Give you an example. When Woodrow Wilson went across the Atlantic to attend the Versailles Conference after the end of the First World War, it took him 10 days to get over there. John Kerry, thus far, has flown 978,000 miles as Secretary of State. That's 38 times around the world at the equator. And we all just, oh yeah, yep, that's right. The biggest building in our country, the largest single building, bigger than any of the buildings, square footage in New York or whatever, is a Boeing plant out in Seattle. Something like 80 million people fly in and out of O'Hare Airport every day. And did they ever say, wait a minute, how'd this ever happen? Who invented this? Who were those guys? You remember the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid where the posse is following him? And one says to the other, who are those guys? And the posse's gaining on it. Who are those guys? Well, that's the way I feel. Who were those guys? And why don't we want to know more about them? I want to know more about them.
That's wonderful. Yes, sir.
Is with iHeartRadio, and you spoke glowingly about Harry Truman, President Truman. On the campaign trail, Donald Trump has made similar comparisons to himself and Harry Truman in terms of having that fighting spirit.
$1,000 a plate, such as we just learned about out in California, dinners. Or the fact that so many of our members of Congress spend virtually all day on the telephone dialing for dollars instead of doing their job. It's a very serious problem. And the only way it's going to change is if we all say no more of that. Stop it.
Our last question. That's all the time we've got. Go ahead.
Mr. McCullough, thank you very much for helping us remember the important things in life.
Thank
I did
you.
want to ask you a question, if I could, if I may be a little bit nosy. When you're not on TV or being interviewed, maybe by Marvin Kalb, what do you do? What's a normal day like for you at home? Do you have a routine you follow? What sort of things do you like to do?
Yes, I get up every morning and go back to work. And I love it. I'm happiest of all when I'm at my desk at my standard Royal typewriter, now in its 75th year. And no problems, never any deferred maintenance, no built-in obsolescence. I've written everything I've written on that typewriter, 975,000 miles or something like that. And people say, don't you realize how much faster you could go if you used a computer, word processor? I said, of course I do, but I want to go more slowly. I'm also asked how much of my time do I spend doing research and how much of my time do I spend writing, which is a perfectly good question. Nobody ever says how much of my time do I spend thinking. Which also helps considerably. I come in for lunch, I go back to work. I try to write about, when I'm really underway, I used to write 4 pages a day, 4 typewritten pages. Now I do about 2 pages a day. And I'm not really a writer, I'm a rewriter. And I write and rewrite and rewrite. The hardest thing of all to learn, the hardest thing to teach young people who want to write is to learn to edit yourself. Hardest of all. And you have to learn to put that chapter you've written on the shelf, let it sit there for a little bit, then have somebody read it aloud to you. My wife, Rosalie, reads everything I write aloud to me because I try to write for the ear, not just the eye. And when you hear it aloud, you hear things that need to be fixed. You've repeated a certain word too often, or you become dull. And so I do a lot of correcting after having had it read aloud. And I retype all of these different versions myself, because in the process of retyping it, I'm also rewriting it, trying to condense. It's old Strunk and White's Elements of Style, which has been my Bible since college. And I keep it right by where I work, and every month or so, I just open it up and read a couple reminders about how you have to be careful to not fall behind the attention and understanding of your reader. Your reader's always a little ahead of you. And make me see. Go to the place the event took place. Go to the town, go to the mountain valley, or whatever it is, and talk to people who live there, because much of what characterizes your character is still to be heard in the use of the language there, the way people speak, the phrases they use. And I love that part of the work.
How do you know when you've got it right?
They die. No, at the end of the book. Oh, when I've got it right?
No, when you're doing the writing and the editing and the rewriting,
Well,
how do you know when you've reached that moment?
I know that there's certain things. I'm not a very good speller, and I know once in a while I'll make a grammatical error. I've had wonderful copy editors, and I've gone back. I have to let about 20 years go by to reread something that I've written, and people say, "Well, do you want to change it? Do you want to edit it?" And in all honesty, I have to say, no, I'm amazed at how good it is. and I am, and I never have any desire to correct something or cut something. Maybe I should, but I don't, because I get tied up in the story all over again. Tell stories. Barbara Tuchman said, there's no secret to writing history. Tell stories. We human beings have to have stories. It's how virtually all information was transmitted through the 9/10 of our time on Earth when we were hunter-gatherers. And you see it in cave paintings, this desire for self-expression, and still goes on, thank goodness. Tell stories. Look at even the worst of the commercials on television. It's a story, always a story. And one of the English writers, I've forgotten which, said the difference between information and a story is, if I tell you the king died and then the queen died, that's information. That's a sequence of events. If I tell you the king died and the queen died of grief, that's a story. It's human feeling, human emotion, human sadness and happiness. And I think in music and in architecture, we find something beyond the usual pleasures or accomplishments or senses of security in life, because both music and architecture are all around you. And if I know you're running out of time, or have run, I want to end with one quick story, because it happened to me here in Washington. I was driving down Massachusetts Avenue on my way to a morning appointment about 9 o'clock, and I ran into a terrible traffic jam at Sheridan Circle. And of course, I had to stop, and nothing was moving. And I looked over there, and there's old Phil Sheridan up on his high horse with a requisite pigeon on his head. And I thought, I wonder how many people who ride around this circle every day, twice a day, thousands and thousands, have any idea who that is or why he's there. And I started to get a little down about that thought. And I was also late, and I was frustrated, I wanted to get going. And all of a sudden, Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue came on my car radio and just lifted me out of my doldrums, lifted me out of the traffic jam, sent me up into the freedom of the blue sky above. And I thought, who's more important to us, to history, to the American story? Phil Sheridan or George Gershwin? Who's with us more today, now, in our own lives? And of course, it's Gershwin. And I thought, but Gershwin doesn't figure much in our notion of who we are and how we got to be where we are. And he should. And I thought, you can't leave Sheridan out, but you shouldn't leave Gershwin out. And then the traffic jam broke up and we moved along, and eventually I began my book called The Greater Journey, which is about those Americans who went to Paris. As we know, Gershwin immortalized that, and led to my writing about painters, doctors, writers, sculptors, and architects going to Paris to bring back what they needed to know in order to make this a better country.
David, I said, absolutely. I said at the very beginning in introducing you that we are honored to have you with us.
Thank you.
I really mean that.
Thank you, Marvin.
Thank you so very much.
I'm honored to know you.